What's up, party people? It's Keys Dan with RadioWhat.com, DJLittleRock.com, coming to you live in a living color from the Radio What studios. And this is my podcast, What Makes You Smarter? It's an extension of the RadioWhat.com internet radio station that I've been running for quite some time. And if you need DJ services, DJLittleRock.com. Let me say that one more time. DJLittleRock.com. Check availability and get a free price quote. And maybe you can have me on the ones and twos, the digital wheels of steel at your next event. And if you'd like to tell your story, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Use the hashtag What Makes You Famous and find it everywhere. Time for a little What Makes You Smarter. Learn with me right here on the program.
Now, on with the show. Today on the program, how America struggled to bury the dead during the 1918 flu pandemic. As a terrifyingly lethal influenza virus swept across the globe between 1918 and 1920, history's deadliest pandemic claimed the lives of approximately 50 million people worldwide and 675,000 in the United States. Nearly 200,000 Americans died from the Spanish flu in October 1918 alone, making it the deadliest month of the country's history. With cremation an uncommon practice at the time, the sheer number of bodies overwhelmed the capacity of undertakers, gravediggers, and casket makers to keep pace with the arduous task of burying the dead. At the same time, a prohibition on public gatherings that included funerals and wakes compounded the pain of many grief-stricken families who could not properly mourn the loss of their loved ones. America was unprepared for the flu's mass mortality. Nancy K. Bristow, a University of Puget Sound's history professor and author of American Pandemic, The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Epidemic, says the United States had been caught unprepared for the outbreak partly because advances in bacteriology made many Americans believe they could control infectious diseases. Quote, "This is not what Americans in 1918 expected to occur," end quote, she says. Quote, "An enormous number of people died very quickly, particularly on the eastern seaboard where the flu struck first, and they didn't have an opportunity to prepare in any way," end quote. The mass mortality led to macabre scenes. Red Cross nurses in Baltimore reported instances of visiting flu-ravaged homes to discover in bed beside dead bodies. In other cases, corpses were covered in ice and shoved into bedroom corners, where they festered for days. Inundated undertakers stacked caskets in funeral home hallways and even in their living quarters. In New Haven, Connecticut, 6-year-old John Delano and his friends played outside of a mortuary, scaling a mountain of caskets piled on a sidewalk, unaware of the contents inside. Quote, "We thought, boy, this is great. It's like climbing the pyramids," end quote, he recalled. Cemeteries struggled to handle the soaring death toll, with gravediggers absent from work, either because they had contracted the flu or were afraid that they would. Grieving families were sometimes forced to excavate tombs for their loved ones. In New Brunswick, New Jersey, 15 workhouse inmates were handed spades and picks to dig graves under the watchful eyes of guards. In Baltimore, city employees were called into emergency duty as gravediggers, while soldiers from Fort Meade were pressed into service to bury a 3-week backlog of 175 bodies at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Casket companies, already busy supplying coffins for the thousands of doughboys killed in World War I, could not keep up with the demand. Facing a desperate shortage in the nation's capital, District of Columbia Commissioner Louis Brownlow hijacked 2 train cars filled with 270 coffins bound for Pittsburgh and rerouted them to the city hospital under armed guard. Gravediggers at Boston's New Calvary Cemetery were spotted dumping corpses out of caskets into graves so that the coffins could be used again. The War Industries Board ordered casket makers to manufacture only plain caskets and immediately ceased production of, quote, all fancy trimmed and couch and split panel varieties, end quote. It limited caskets for adults to 5 feet 9 inches and 6 feet 3 inches. Philadelphia resembled the plague-infested Middle Ages. The worst horrors were seen in Philadelphia, where the number of deaths approached 1,000 a day at the pandemic's peak. Entire neighborhoods were draped in crepe that was mounted on front doors to mark deaths inside. Civic leaders recruited the J.G. Brill Company, a streetcar manufacturer, to construct thousands of rudimentary boxes in which to bury the dead, while desperately needed coffins arrived in the city under armed guard. 500 bodies crowded the city morgue, which had a capacity for only 36 corpses. The city scrambled to open 6 supplementary morgues and placed bodies in cold storage plants. Some Philadelphia residents were unceremoniously tossed into mass graves that had been hollowed out by steam shovels. Quote, they were primarily poor and immigrant residents, so there's a class aspect, as well as the well-to-do were more likely to secure the rites of passage into death in a way that poorer and more recent arrivals were less able to, quote, Bristow says. The scenes in Philadelphia appeared to be straight out of the plague-infested Middle Ages. Throughout the day and night, horse-drawn wagons kept a constant parade through the streets of Philadelphia as priests joined the police in collecting corpses draped in sackcloth and blood-stained sheets that were left on porches and sidewalks. The bodies were piled on top of each other in the wagons with limbs protruding from underneath the sheets. The parents of one small boy who succumbed to the flu begged the authorities to allow him the dignity of being buried in a wooden box that had been used to ship macaroni instead of wrapping him in a sheet and having him taken away in a patrol wagon. Restrictions on public events impacted how people mourned. Public funerals and wakes were banned in cities including Philadelphia and Chicago. Iowa prohibited public funerals and even the opening of caskets. Exceptions were made only for parents or wives identifying soldiers before burial, and even then, they could only open the caskets if family members covered their mouths and noses with masks and refrained from touching the body. Quote, in many communities, processing the loss of loved ones entails a series of rituals and rites and laying a person to rest in a respectful way, end quote, Bristol says. Quote, in many cities, the restrictions on public events meant that families and communities had those rites interrupted, so grieving didn't take place in public, but became an individual process which had long-term consequences. Without an opportunity to share it with those around them, that grief was carried around for decades, end quote. That's a little bit about how America struggled to bury the dead during the 1918 flu pandemic. This has been What Makes You Smarter. I hope everyone's doing reasonably well. If you'd like to tell your story or hear the stories of others, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. That's it for me. It's Keys Dan, RadioWhat.com, DJLittleRock.com. Peace. I'm out of here.
If you like what you hear, I encourage you to follow What Makes You Smarter on social media. Find it on Facebook at What Makes You Smarter, Instagram at What Makes You Smarter, Twitter at SmarterWhat, and YouTube, username Keys Dan. Leave What Makes You Smarter podcast a review and subscribe. Listen to What Makes You Smarter podcast on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Podcast Addict. My personal favorite, learn with me on my podcast, What Makes You Smarter. And if you'd like to tell your story, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. Call 501-470-6386 and leave a message to set up a time for What Makes You Famous. Support What Makes You Smarter podcast using the PayPal, paypal.me/KeysDan. radio.me/KeysDan. Email info@radiowhat.com. What Makes You Smarter is a production of Keys Dan Enterprises Incorporated at keysdan.com. Thank you for listening.